evening and welcome. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein of Valley Beth Shalom, and part of our congregation's celebration of this 75th Yom Ha'atzmaut is an opportunity to talk to our Zionist heroes. And today I have a really wonderful opportunity to spend a few moments with my dear friend and wonderful teacher, Yossi Klein Halevi. Yossi is a worldwide well-known journalist, not writer of books, and investigator of all things Israel and all things Jewish. Yossi, thank you for being with us this holiday, this very special time.
I'm thrilled to be with you, Ed. There are very few people that I would rather unpack Israel at 75 with than you, and I mean that.
And the wonderful thing, I think we should disclose this to the audience, is that Yossi today happens to be in the city of Vancouver awaiting the arrival of his first grandchild. So with all of our hearts, all of our prayers for health and strength and a beautiful life to come. Thank you for sharing these moments with us. If I hear a baby crying in the back, we're going to cut out. That takes precedence. That takes precedence. So, Yossi, there's a lot to talk about happening now in Israel. But before we get to that, because we are part of a celebration of Yom Ha'atzmaut, let's go back a bit. You grew up in a family of survivors and came to Israel. I think you and I were there at the same time in 1973 as a college student. What do you remember from that experience?
Not only were we there at the same time, we were in the same program. The one-year program at the junior year abroad at Hebrew University. And what an extraordinary time that was to spend a year in Israel. We got there in the summer of 73, which was the most peaceful time in Israel. There was nothing happening on the borders. There was no terrorism. And then Yom Kippur, 73, the country is totally overturned.
So where were you that Yom Kippur?
I was with my grandparents. My mother's parents lived in Israel. And I was in synagogue with my grandfather. And we hear the siren and nobody knows what's going on. And then people start disappearing from the pews. And soldiers are coming and pulling people out, getting them to their units. I remember sitting next to this guy and he tells me, he looks at me as an American and he says, they've got to be crazy to start with us. He said, didn't they learn their lesson in 67? He said, we've probably already won the war. Now, of course, Yom Kippur turned out very differently. It was those first days were existential. We were caught completely unawares on two fronts. And it took a little while for the Israeli home front to internalize that this wasn't going to be another 1967. And to some extent, I think the country never recovered from that shock of coming face to face with our mortality. Because when you look at what happened in those first days, the roads to Tel Aviv and Haifa were open. We were defenseless. And if the Arab armies had pressed ahead, and luckily they didn't because they feared that there was a trap, there was no trap. Tel Aviv and Haifa were open. And but that we on the home front only learned gradually. And I don't know, where were you in those weeks?
So I was, my parents, a different background than yours. My parents were Hashomer Tzayir Americans. They were born in America. My grandparents are European. My parents made Aliyah in 1949. Oh, wow. My father was the baker in Kibbutz Amir, and my mother was the maskira. She ran everything, the garin. Wow. They built a garin in a kibbutz called Barkai, which is not far from there. Yeah. So I'd spent the summer on kibbutz with the funny is, my father's ex-girlfriend was my kibbutz mother. Right? So she adopted me right away. Made sure I was taken very good care. I had an idyllic summer living as a mitnadev, a volunteer on a kibbutz, picking avocados, laying down irrigation pipes.
How do you say avocado in
avocado?
English?
How do you say avocado in English? And it was idyllic. And then I left and came down to the university. I was at Ulpan. We were living in Kiryat Yovel and going to Ulpan. And I want to have an authentic Israeli experience. So Yom Kippur, I went up into the old city and davened in the Ramban synagogue, sitting next to this old Mizrahi fellow. We had a wonderful time, and just sitting and davening. And then the service came to an end. I was supposed to meet some friends at the Kotel, and the sirens went off. And the guards there told us, go home. And I was about to go home, and some giant chassid stood in the middle of the road and said, Minyan, Minyan. And he grabbed me and pulled me up into some base midrash, and we davened Mincha and Nilat Mariv and did bench Levana. And then I went back to my program and discovered that a war had started in the world.
And that's when you decided you have to become a rabbi.
No, it was one of those experiences. Spent 2 weeks in Israel volunteering. I was on a bread truck. We did a bread run to all the super, and then went back to the kibbutz. And the kibbutz was amazing because all the men were gone. So there was another volunteer and we took over all these different anafim of the kibbutz, all these different industries of the kibbutz, because they needed people power. They needed people to do stuff. And every afternoon we went to the tzrifim, to the homes of kibbutz mothers, and held their hands. Because remember, the first few weeks, nobody knew anything. Nobody knew if anybody had been hurt, had been killed, had been shot. It was so frightening.
I actually know a number of people who were in Israel as volunteers during the Yom Kippur War and decided to become rabbis as a result of that experience. And the way it played out for me, fortunately, I didn't decide to become a rabbi. I would have made a terrible rabbi. No. But I was reaffirmed in my, I'd say, vague decision to live in Israel. And having experienced Israel during war and experienced that sense of total solidarity and family, just that instinctive familial Israeliness, I knew that I had to be there. And the irony for me is that when I did move to Israel, it was 1982. How many years later? 8 years later? 7 years later? No, it was 9 years later. I'm not so good at arithmetic. I landed in the middle of the First Lebanon War, which was the antithesis of the Yom Kippur War. Mm-hmm. In Yom Kippur, everyone pulled together. In the First Lebanon War, the society pulled apart. Israelis were just tearing each other apart. It was the first and only time that war not only failed to unite us, but was the actual reason for the society being divided. So it was a very good introduction as a new immigrant to Israeli reality, to becoming at a low moment when you didn't have that reassuring feeling of family, or maybe, to put it in a different way, we were acting as a dysfunctional family.
Right. Right. The other thing about 73, besides this sense of existential threat, which was very, very real, very, very real, was as the war went on and as we began to get the stories, the 6 months in, guys started coming back with stories. I was in the university, I was living in the dormitories in Givat Ram, and these guys came back just to take their exams. And so we were helping them with I remember sitting with a guy translating a psychology textbook, just reading through it and then trying to explain it. But the thing that happened there too was that all of our heroes were torn down. Right. Golda was torn down. Moshe Dayan was torn down. Right. All of these gods of Israel that had been there since 67 and before, all of a sudden became objects of derision and of criticism. And in some ways, a generation passed, that my parents' generation passed at that moment.
Right, exactly right. That was the end of labor Israel.
Yeah.
And if you look at the Labor Party today, they're the smallest party in the Knesset, 4 seats. It's unbelievable. This is the party that founded the state of Israel, that governed uncontested for the first 3 decades of the state. Today is virtually erased.
So in 1982, you make Aliyah.
Yeah.
And you marry in Israel and you raise a family in Israel. So when you look back at the whole project, tell me what you're thankful for.
You know, we're talking about family and this feeling of being part of a larger Jewish family experience. Today, I was going through Israeli Twitter, and I came across this extraordinary clip. A TV journalist went to the scene of the terror attack in Tel Aviv last night in Dizengoff, and he finds his brother there. And on air, his first question to his brother, he's interviewing his brother as an eyewitness, and he said, "Hitkasharta le'ima?" Did you call mom to let her know you're okay? And this is just perfectly normal on Israel TV. Of course, that's what you want. A journalist who's just met his brother. In other words, before you're a journalist, you're a son, you're a brother, and that is what's so precious about Israel. And I know you're asking us to linger for a moment on what we love about Israel, but I have to say that that's what I fear we're standing to lose if the situation gets any worse internally in Israel. But it's that we have something so precious to fight for. And Israel is look, we talked about being a dysfunctional family. Israel very often is a dysfunctional family. But how many places exist where you call, and I've had this happen to me, I call the operator and I ask for the number of a restaurant. And she said, I heard it's really good. You know? And suddenly there's a human being on the other side. And we're having a conversation about, what are the great restaurants? And, thanks, bye, mommy, and I'm not saying that happens all the time, or even most, or even much of the time. But when it happens, it's within a context that's culturally recognizable. It's not an anomaly. And there's something so powerful about knowing that you're in a country that's not just a country.
It's a beautiful thing. I remember in one of my first trips, somebody said to me, you have to remember that the waiters in restaurants are not motivated by tips. They're motivated by respect. So
that's a great way to put it.
Israelis now, and they say, so what you do is when you come in, you look to, I said, what's your name? Ask him where he's from, ask him if he's had a hard day. And then at the end of the meal, he'll come to you and say, are you still hungry? Are you still hungry? Can I bring you something? And Americans have a very different culture, but this idea that we are all, the personal connections matter more than the functional, impersonal connections.
Yeah. And look, becoming an Israeli, joining Israeli society, at a moment where that sense of the familial was being tested to the limits. Right? In the first Lebanon war, when you had draft resistance, you had people refusing to fight at the front. While people were fighting at the front, you had demonstrations happening in the home front. There was a real sense of the fragility of the Israeli enterprise. But that reinforced my commitment to trying to listen as deeply as I could to the arguments that were being made across the political and cultural spectrum, to really take seriously the different sides of the Israeli argument. And that experience made me a centrist. And my definition of the Israeli center is that is the place where we try to reconcile our irreconcilable differences.
And you have this, the world knows you as wonderful journalist and observer of Israel and its politics, but I also know that you have another side, that you are an exquisite observer of Israeli popular culture, because you have an exquisite ear for Israeli popular music, which is where so much of popular culture lives. So tell me a bit about that, about the popular musical voice, or rather the popular voice from the inside of the heart of Israelis. Now, you and I were raised in America, but for those who are like your kids, Israelis, where are they today? What are they thankful for in Israel? What are they worried about in Israel today? Where is that popular voice today?
Wow. In terms of Israeli music, what I owe Israeli music is my entry into the soul of the country. And you can't really understand Israel without understanding its music. The music is where Israelis play out the inner tensions, dramas, the love of the country, the fears. There's no popular music like this that I know of. Certainly American music, and I grew up in the 1960s, as did you, and I loved. I to this day, the music of the 60s is my personal soundtrack. But Israeli music is the music of poets. And not all, obviously we have lots of fluff, we have lots of, standard pop songs, but the soundtrack of Israeli history is recorded in the music. I'll give you an example. We're now we're another one of those moments where we're tearing ourselves apart as a society. And I was waiting for, where are the songs? Why aren't we hearing the musicians giving us back the experience through music of what we're going through? And today I found a song by Shlomo Artzi and Avidan, I forget his first name, a fantastic song called Achim, Hayinu Achim, we were brothers. And notice the past tense. It's a melancholy song. Pam Hayinu Achim, once we were brothers. Where has that gone? Are we going to be brothers again? And the song was so emotionally precise in reflecting what this moment is, because when I spoke before about that sense of family, that's the feeling that we're losing now in Israel. There's so much bitterness, there's so much fear, and I'm part of that. I've taken sides in this struggle. Mm-hmm. I am vehemently opposed to this government. I consider this government a disgrace, not only to Israel, to the Jewish people. And I will do everything I can to defend Israeli democracy, which this government is threatening. But at the same time, there's this deep melancholy and fear that we're losing what's most precious about Israel. And so along comes Shlomo Artzi and gives us back this beautiful song, Achim Hayinu. And it's really worth listening to. Maybe it's worth playing. It's something that what's beautiful about it is it's simple, and it's not making the big emotional declarations about how we're one people. That would not be true to this moment. And what I love about the Israeli musicians is the precise way that they intuit the national mood. The national mood at this moment is not we are one nation, we're one family. There is a profound severance. And at the same time, what the song manages to capture is the longing for us to reclaim that sense of family.
So no matter how hard I try or we try, we're not going to be able to avoid this. So let's take a look. So let me ask you the broadest question. There's something bitterly ironic. It's the 75th anniversary of the country. That the country survived 1 year was a miracle. That it survived through the 50s was a miracle. That it survived 1967 was a miracle. That it overcame 1973 was a miracle. That it overcame 82 was a miracle. And so now you make it to 75. And objectively, if one were a student of history, and God willing, someone will do this one day, 500 years from now, the country was prosperous, relatively at peace, positioned incredibly strongly in the region with the Abraham Accords, incredibly strongly in the American, in America's orbit and in Europe's orbit, building relations with new countries. There was every reason that this should have been a moment of profound celebration. And yet, right now, as you said, Achim Hayinu, the country seems to be tearing itself apart. How did it come to this? How did this happen? Tell us from the inside.
I think first to just step back for a moment and look at Jewish history and who we are as a people. Let me make two big statements about the Jews. The first is that there's no people on earth that's more capable of creating something from nothing than we are. And if you think about this Jewish story moving from 1945, the lowest point in Jewish history, to this generation, which I think is the peak moment of certainly Jewish power and self-confidence and our presence on the world stage. We've never had a stronger sovereign Jewish state. Going back to the Davidic kingdom, this is as good as it gets. We've never had a more self-confident diaspora than American Jewry, and these two centers happening and emerging simultaneously. It's the most extraordinary moment in Jewish history. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I don't know if there's another people that's more capable of turning a miracle into the opposite, into ruining what it's created. And we have that deep fear in ourselves that goes back 2,000 years. It goes back to the Churban, to the destruction of the Second Temple period. And that is deeply rooted in our being. We know that there is it's almost as if we have a self-destructive gene where schism becomes our default position. And we're living at one of those inconceivable moments in Jewish history where we're taking the most extraordinary success that any people has ever managed, and we're putting it all at risk. Now, I place the blame entirely. For me, on this issue, there are no two sides here. There is a government that has pushed several million Israelis to a place of despair. And this is a government that, let's look first of all at the composition of this government. We talk about a coalition, right? Israel is a coalition system. And the reason it's a coalition system is because we are an impossibly diverse society, which is a reflection of what we call the ingathering of the exiles. When you bring Jews back from 100 different countries and as many sensibilities and ideologies and ideas about what a Jewish state is supposed to be, you can only govern this country from a place of coalition. And every coalition we have ever had from the founding of the state until this government was heterogeneous. Some coalitions were radically heterogeneous. The last coalition, the Bennett-Lapid government, was the most diverse coalition we have ever had in Israeli history. This government is the most homogeneous coalition we've ever had. There isn't a single party in this coalition that is dissonant, that can give a dissonant voice. They're either hard right or further hard right. That's what we have now. And so that's the first starting point. We've never had a coalition whose message to half of Israel was, you don't belong. You're not part of our Israel. When I look at this government, there is no party that reflects who I am. Now, in the past, I have voted for the Likud. This is not the Likud that I voted for. This is not a liberal nationalist party. This is a hard right party that has given up liberal ideas. And by liberal, I mean in a very broad term. Liberal that includes moderate conservatives, moderate liberals, a coalition of people who believe in democracy, in the primacy of the rule of law, in the sacred integrity of the Supreme Court. And I use that word very deliberately, the sacredness of the rule of law. This is a government that has declared war on the Zionist ethos in multiple ways. First, in terms of how we understand Israel as a democracy. What is a democracy? Is it the simple rule of the majority? You get 61 Knesset members and you can then ride roughshod over the 59? That is the message that we have heard consistently from this government. We won, we can do whatever we want. And there is an alternative notion of democracy, which is the liberal idea. And that is that democracy is a delicate dance between the rights of the majority and the rights of the minority. And it is the role of the court not to reflect the government, but to reflect those who are not in the government. That's exactly the role of the court. And what this government is trying to do is arrogate all power to itself. In effect, neuter the Supreme Court. We don't have proper checks and balances. We only have one parliamentary house. We have no constitution. And so if you neutralize the court, all power of governance falls into the hands of the prime minister. So that's the first front that we're fighting on. There's another front here, which is, what do we mean by a Jewish state? Is Israel the state of the Jewish people, or is it the state of Judaism? And particularly one denomination of Judaism. The classical understanding of Zionism is that Israel is the state of the Jewish people, whoever we are, the whole mess, the whole Jewish mess. That's what Israel reflects. And we are not the repository of one purist notion of what it means to be a Jew, but we are the meeting ground of the conflict that has opened up in modernity of what it means to be Jewish. And even of how you define who is a Jew. There's the Orthodox idea of who is a Jew, and then there's the Zionist idea of who is a Jew that's reflected in the law of return. The law of return is a very strange document. It creates a whole new category of people who are part of the Jewish people. One Jewish grandparent. That's a precedent. But that is the Zionist way of coming to terms with what modernity has done to the Jewish people. We're not the same people that we were 200 years ago. The Orthodox want us to be frozen to where we were 200 years ago. And Zionism says, no, we accept, the state of Israel has to accept the Jews as we are. And that is another front. So if I can just have one last word here, which is that to come back to your central point of Israel at 75, what makes this moment so poignant is that on our 75th birthday, we're having the most profound identity crisis in our history. We're having a kind of nervous breakdown about who we are in the most basic way. That, in the end, is what of course, we're arguing about corruption and whether a prime minister who's on trial on 3 counts of corruption has the right to even tamper with the judicial system. Those are all really important issues. But the fundamental issues that have opened up in Israel today are, what do we mean by Israel as a Jewish state? what do we mean by Israel's a democratic state?
So, my sense is that, and I think this is what we see from here, is that the judicial reform may have been the catalyst of this moment, but the issues are much bigger than that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And look, one does have to say that the judicial debate is enormous in its own right. But you're right. This has been a catalyst for example, the question of the ultra-Orthodox role in Israeli society, the state within a state that they've created, is now front and center in the protest movement. Everyone is talking about this again. And or the violence that happened in Hawara last week, 2 weeks ago, the pogrom by hundreds of settlers. This moment is forcing us to look at deep distortions in Israeli society that have been allowed to go unchecked for decades. And I look at what I was willing to swallow all these years, and I'm as guilty as anyone else in Israel. And I'm a commentator. It's my job to be pointing out problems. And I allowed certain deep corrupting processes to go unchallenged. And so this is a moment of reckoning. It's a very painful moment. But I feel that liberal Israel, and again, I'm using liberal in a very wide sense, liberal Israel has awakened. And it's an extraordinary moment. And have you been to Israel in the last few months, Ed? Have you?
No, but I've been with people who have been and told me that these demonstrations are the most stirring experiences they've ever had.
I just want to cry when I think about what it's like standing there. You're standing in the middle of literally tens of thousands of Israeli flags, not just demonstrators. Everybody brings their big Israeli flag. And, and I look at these people, I say, how is it that everyone has these giant Israeli flags at their homes? I have these little flags, and people come, and it's, you're in a sea of blue and white. And what you feel at those demonstrations is the overwhelming love that people have for Israel. And, Netanyahu tried to discredit the demonstrations by saying, these are leftists. I'm not a leftist, but I wouldn't use leftist as a dirty word. They're a legitimate part of our debate, certainly Zionist leftists. So Netanyahu characterizes the demonstrations as leftist, so they're beyond the pale. But at leftist demonstrations, the most prevalent symbol is the Israeli flag. Now look at left-wing demonstrations in America. My sense is that you don't have tens of thousands of giant American flags being raised.
If anything, the opposite. The flag was co-opted by the right.
Exactly. And what's so beautiful in Israel is that the flag belongs to everyone. But if I had to sum up in one line what these demonstrations are about, we are protesting for the right to continue to hold the Israeli flag with pride. That's what we're fighting for.
The other thing, I think, the other symbol of this, which I'm taken with really, is the Declaration of Independence.
Yes.
And one of the demonstrations, one of the pictures that was in the newspaper was someone brought, people obviously brought a copy of the Declaration. It must have been a half a kilometer long, a quarter of a mile long. And it's on buildings now. And there's apparently now it's being read in synagogues around the world in lieu of the prayer for the state, especially the last paragraph that says we establish a state which is Jewish, democratic for all of its citizens without regard to that declaration, and its aspirations has now been embraced.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the most stirring Zionist experience that I've had in years. And it's happening supposedly in an opposition movement, I don't see this as an opposition movement. This is an affirmative movement. This is a movement to celebrate, reclaim everything that we love about Israel as a Jewish and democratic state.
Sit with me for a moment now and let's play prophet. We've talked about the past and we've talked about the present. Come with me on a trip. We're going to go to Israel's 100th anniversary. God willing, you and I make it. But in 2048, give me 3 scenarios of what that day could show us about Israel. The best, the worst, and the likely.
Well, the worst I don't want to say.
Okay.
And I think I've just said it. The best is that we figure out how to use or how to turn our crises into opportunities. And we often have done that in the past. I think about Israel in 1985, when we had 400% inflation, and the country created a national unity government, and we pulled back from the brink, and that was the beginning of Startup Nation. We went from being Argentina at its worst days to being Startup Nation. So we have the capacity to pull back from the edge of the abyss and to turn trauma and failure into the opposite. So the best case scenario is that we figure out how to be a genuine Jewish and democratic state where the tensions between those two identities are, if not entirely resolved, at least able to coexist in a way where Arab citizens feel that they can be part, to some extent, not just of Israeli society, but even Israeli identity, and where the Jewish majority doesn't fear that it's going to lose the Jewishness of the Israeli identity by admitting Arabs into our shared civic identity. So, and that's one facet where we figure out a way of extricating ourselves from the occupation. And I'm not going to say a two-state solution, which is the solution that I have personally supported. But if we come to the point where a two-state solution becomes impossible, then we examine other solutions that still maintain Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, maybe a confederation. I don't know. I don't want to go there now, but there are other options that we may need to consider, and that we continue to be a society where Ashkenazim and Mizrahim are marrying each other, and where we figure out a way of bringing the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, into the process of the ingathering, because right now they're completely excluded, self-excluded from this great meeting point of Israeli society. So that's the best case scenario. What I think is likely to happen is that the situation will be better than it looks today. We will, God willing, get through this, but we will continue to have existential threats. They may be new existential threats. But I don't see us extricating ourselves from being a society that lives in a state of, to some extent, life and death dilemmas. And if I could just say one thing about what I think is so significant about Israeli democracy, which is what we're fighting for now. And that is that Israeli democracy, Israel is not a paragon of democracy. We never were. There were always problematic elements in Israeli democracy. And that's unavoidable, because there's no other democracy in the world that faces the kinds of security threats that we do. from day one. There's no other democracy that was born in war and never knew a day of real peace, whose enemies have taken out a fatwa against our existence. And so we live in the kind of situation that would have destroyed other democracies if they had been where we are. The miracle of Israeli democracy is not that we're a paragon of objective democratic norms, but we are a paragon of the struggle to maintain democracy under impossible conditions. That's what's so precious about the Israeli democratic experiment. That's what makes Israel a laboratory for democracy under conditions of extremity. And the reason why Israel is worth paying attention to as a democracy is because of that. Look at the balancing act that we need to do between security and democracy. Look at even when we screw up, the fault lines in Israeli democracy are worth studying, because that tells you something about what are the weak elements in a democracy when it's applied, when overwhelming pressure is applied. Now, the pride of Israeli democracy is that we're still struggling. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, this is both the most painful moment to my mind in Israel's history, and that's saying a lot, because the threat to democracy is now coming from within. It's not coming from the security situation. It's self-generated by our own government. And on the other hand, we've never struggled harder for democracy than we are today.
Well, see, it's not just the security threats, though. The other side is the internal thing, because the moment the country began, you absorbed 1 million Jews from Eastern countries, from the Mizrach, who had no notion of enlightenment, much less democracy. Then a few years later, 1 million Russians who had no notion of Western democracy. How do you absorb such disparate populations without common culture?
Absolutely. Look, start with the first wave of immigrants in 1948 who were Holocaust survivors. 300,000 Holocaust survivors coming from the displaced persons camps. And so you have the most traumatized refugees coming overwhelmingly from societies with no democratic tradition into a permanent pressure cooker, and still not only maintaining democratic institutions, but growing them. In many ways, Israel, until these last few months, was a much more vibrant democracy than it was in its early years, in the supposedly good old days of the Labor Party.
Right.
We became much more democratic in the 70s and the 80s and 90s. And so you're right. You know, it's one of the most extraordinary stories of democracy.
Let me ask you one more question about this, because I do want to get back to something celebratory. But so you're such an acute observer of this. Where does the right come from? Where does the hard right, the ultra-nationalist, authoritarian right, the Ben Gvir, Smotrich right, where does that come from in Israeli society?
Look, to some extent, Ed, I can actually speak from personal experience here. Because
once upon a time
in the late 1960s, a very long once upon a time ago, I was a follower of Meir Kahane, and I come very much out of the hard right. Now, it was a bit different in America than it is in Israel. In America, we were fighting for Soviet Jewry. The issue was protecting defenseless Jews and changing neighborhoods.
Right.
So it's not quite the same, but there is a carryover. And Meir Kahane moved from Brooklyn to Israel and took with him that sense of diaspora vulnerability. And never made the transition to being a real Israeli. He never understood that we actually are a sovereign state with a very strong army. And we don't have to rely on the tactics that whether we needed to or not is a separate issue, that he felt we needed to protect ourselves in the diaspora. And he remained the diaspora Jew in Israel. That was part of the distortion. And the Israeli followers, Ben Gvir and others who gathered around Kahanism, Ben Gvir actually never knew Kahana. Ben Gvir came later. He's the next generation. But what they internalized from Kahanist ideology is that the Jews can never have enough power. The name of his party is Jewish Power. Now, Jewish Power it's a ludicrous title for a party in a sovereign Jewish state. What, are you the only one who cares about Jewish power? We didn't all serve in the army? I mean, what are you talking about? We need Ben Gvir to teach us about Jewish power. Ben Gvir, for heaven's sake, wasn't even in the army. The army refused to draft him because he had a criminal record. So I need Ben Gvir to teach me about Jewish power. So there's a deep exilic mindset on the far fringes of the Israeli right. There is nothing more dangerous, and this is a general observation, than someone who has power but sees himself as a victim. The beauty of Zionism was that it rejected victimhood. There are two Jewish camps that revel in Jewish victimhood. The first is the far right, and the other is the far left. And each of them takes this in a different direction. The far left wants us to revert to the purity of Jewish powerlessness. They want us to be noble victims. And the far right believes that we still are victims. And the sane majority of the Jewish people, both in Israel and in the diaspora, embrace power as a good, but don't revel in power. We don't celebrate power. We're grateful for the fact that we can protect ourselves. And that's a very different move. And the far right in Israel, they don't understand Jewish power, and that's why they cling to it so desperately.
This has been wonderful, Yossi. Thank you. Let me just finish with a simple thing. You joined with two other writers, Monty Friedman and Donnie Gordis, in an incredible letter to us, to Diaspora Jewry, about this moment and what it demands. So I'll give you a moment to tell us, on this Yom Ha'atzmaut, what would you like to say to us, to Diaspora Jewry?
I think it's time for Israelis and diaspora Jews to be Jewish grown-ups together. And that means that we need to create a new, mature relationship. I'm not looking for uncritical supporters of Israel. And I'm also not looking for critics who are only critics of Israel. I'm looking for a real nuanced relationship where you love us but you also call us out when we need to be reprimanded. I need my brothers and sisters to hold up a mirror to me. You're the ones who I can trust most to tell me, what do I look like in the world? What do I look like to our friends? Never mind our enemies. I'm not accountable morally to our enemies, but I am accountable to our friends. And I need to be accountable most of all to you. If I'm not accountable to you, then who am I accountable to? And so let's start thinking about our relationship in a real way. And the only way that we're going to salvage in the long term the diaspora-Israel relationship is if we move past the point of thinking about salvaging the relationship. Right now, everybody's talking about, how do we save this relationship? That's not where we need to be. We need to be taking this moment as an opportunity to rethink the relationship. How do we deepen our spiritual connections? We are all responsible for the next phase of Judaism. What is Judaism supposed to look like in an era of Jewish sovereignty and of freedom in the diaspora? We haven't begun to really think deeply, certainly not in Israel. I think American Jews have thought more deeply about what Judaism is supposed to look like in modernity. We have a lot to learn from you on that. I think that American Jews have a lot to learn from Israelis about what it means to be creating a vibrant Jewish culture. We talked about the music. That music doesn't only belong to me. That music belongs to the Jewish people. It's the most fantastic Hebrew creation. And it's happening mostly in Israel, but it belongs to all of us. Why don't American Jews know this music? So these are just some random ideas about how we can be deepening the relationship. If we keep the relationship just on a political level, it's not going to survive. And the letter that you referred to, that Mati and Danny and I wrote to American Jews, was an appeal not to further politicize the relationship, but to take responsibility for the nature of Israeli democracy, for the survival of Israeli democracy. That's just not it isn't only my responsibility, it's your responsibility too. We can talk about how American Jews can be useful in this struggle, but it should be a given that American Jews not only have the right to be involved, but the responsibility. This is a shared effort. And if we're serious about Israel as the state of the Jewish people, then we need to own that. And I say that as an Israeli. That means not only tolerating American Jewish criticism when it comes, but welcoming it, as difficult as it is. I don't have to always agree with it. I certainly don't always have to listen to it, but I need to, but by listening to it, I mean, I don't always need to agree with it and adjust my policies, but I certainly need to take it into consideration.
Yossi, thank you so much for this time. Really appreciate it. Your insights are so valuable. Your deep love for the people of Israel and the land of Israel and its culture is so beautiful. And I want to be one of the very first to wish you a wonderful Sabbahood as you begin this new time of your life. May this child bring great light and great joy to you and to your family. Kol Tuv. Take good care.